as a warm-up today, let's begin by figuring out where the x-intercepts would be for each of these parabolas. So remember, when it was in factored form, this allowed us to find our x-intercepts simply by taking the numbers out of the brackets and changing the signs. So my x-intercept here would be at 3, 0, and my x-intercept here would be at -5, 0. So that's nice and easy to read when it's in factored form. This allows us to see those x-intercepts or our roots or zeros be found simply by looking at what's inside the brackets. Now, if you're given something like this, whoops, and asked to find your x-intercepts, this is not in factored form. And so it's in standard form, right? Standard form, which doesn't help us. But if we could put it into factored form, then it would. So luckily, we know how to put this into factored form. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to -36, but add together give me a -5. And those two numbers would be -9 and +4. So I know I can express this in factored form by writing it as y equals x minus 9, x plus 4. And then from there, I can figure out my x-intercepts by taking it out of the brackets. And it's at 9, 0, and -4, 0. So those are my x-intercepts. So if you're given something in standard form, then we need to rewrite it in factored form, which is why it's so important for us to know how to factor. Well, today we're going to continue on our factoring adventures, and we're going to look at how to factor those tough trinomials. And the method that we're going to use is called decomposition. Okay, so we're going to move along to tougher trinomials. All right, so just a review of what we were doing before. This is a simple trinomial. So we were looking, and we know it's a simple trinomial because there's a 1 in front of the x squared. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to -48, but add together give me 8. And if I think about this, two numbers, it's going to be, let me think, 4 and 12. 4 and 12. Now I know one of them is positive and one of them is negative because it's a -48, but I want a +8. So then it's going to be a -4. So x plus 12, x minus 4 would be my factors. And then remember when we had these 4 terms and we were doing common factoring by grouping, So I kind of put a line there and I'll look at my first 2 terms and I see I have a 3x that's common. And then that would leave me with an x minus 2y. And then over here, I could take out a +5a, and that would leave me with an x minus 2y. And then I can see from there, if I look at this as an individual term, and I look at this as an individual term, I can see that x minus 2y is common in both. And if I common factor out an x minus 2y out of here, I'm left with a 3x. And if I common factor out an x minus 2y over here, I'm left with that +5a. And then that brings us back to those two binomials that were multiplied together to give us this big expanded form. Okay, so today, in order to do these tougher trinomials, we're going to have to remember simple factoring, but we're also going to have to remember some factoring by grouping in order for us to get through this. All right, so tough trinomials, what we call tougher trinomials, that a value is going to be a number in front, except now it's not going to be, it's definitely not going to be a 0. It's definitely not going to be a 1 either, and we're not going to be able to common factor this out. So a good example of this would be this example, 3x squared plus 8x plus 4. I have this 3 in front, which means I can't just do my simple factoring. But it also means that as I look through, I can't common factor it out either. So we're going to be looking at how do I factor it if I have this number that's in front of my x squared. So to help us out here, we're going to do some decomposition. That's the process that we use. we have some steps. And so let me just bring out my steps. I'm going to put them down here, I suppose. So my steps are, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to find two numbers that multiply to A times C, but add to B. So the first step that we're going to do is we're actually going to multiply these two numbers together. So 3 times 4, which is 12. And then I'm going to compare it to my middle number, which is an 8. And I want to find two numbers that multiply to 12, but add together, give me 8. And you probably would have come up with 6 and 2. Those are our two numbers. Now it tells me to replace my B value. So here's my B value. I'm going to replace it with those two new numbers. Okay, so for that to happen, let me just kind of move this down. I'm going to take that B and I'm going to break it down into these two new numbers. So now I'm going to have 3x squared plus 6x plus 2x plus 4. And see how this doesn't change my middle term? My middle term is still 8x, but I've broken it down into these two numbers that also add to 8x. So these two expressions are equal, which is important to do. We have to make sure they're equal. And then now that we have 4 terms, we're going to do our factoring by grouping. So this is the same thing that we did before. I'm going to put a line kind of right there in between those first two and those second two. And then I'm going to common factor. So I can take out a 3x over here, which leaves me with x plus 2. And I can take out a positive 2 here, which leaves me with x plus 2. And then from there, I can just write my common factor now, or my common binomial, is this x plus 2. And then if I take an x plus 2 out of here, I'm left with a 3x. And if I take an x plus 2 out of here, I'm left with a plus 2. So then this becomes. Now, let's do a check, because I think it's important for us to just make sure that we did this right. So remember, we can always do a check by simply using FOIL to expand this out and see what we get. So x times 3x is 3x squared. X times 2 is 2x. 2 times 3x is 6x. And 2 times 2 is 4. And that gives me 3x squared plus 8x plus 4, which is the exact same thing that we started with. Now, just one other thing that I want to mention, just because I get asked this every once in a while, and I want you to realize that it's the same thing. So our answer was x plus 2, 3x plus 2. If you happen to get an answer of 3x plus 2 and x plus 2, these are exactly the same, okay? So they're the same, and because it's multiplication, so it doesn't matter which binomial is first and which one is second, as long as we have them both there, okay? So order does not matter, so don't be too overly concerned about that. Okay, let's try one then. Let's try another one. So I'm just gonna take this and shrink it up a little bit. So there's my steps. Still have my steps. So here's one that I'd like you to try. So there we go. 6g squared plus 17g plus 5. So I want you to give that one a try. See how you do. Pause the video and then come on back. Okay, so hopefully you started by taking your first number and multiplying it by the last number, which gave you 30. And then comparing it to your middle number, which was 17. And two numbers that multiply to 30 but add to give you 17 are 5 and 2. So I'm actually going to break apart my middle term into 15g plus 2g and then plus 5. And then from there, I'm going to look at the first two terms and I'm going to look at the second two terms and common factors. So I can take out a 3g over here, gives me 2g plus 5 inside my brackets. And then as I look at this second, I have 2g plus 5. I realize there's nothing I can take out, but we do not put a 0, okay? Remember, multiplying by 0 always gives us 0. That's not what we want. So we're going to put like a placement holder. We're going to put a 1, okay? Because if I multiply 1 times anything, I always end up with the same thing. So 1 is my placement holder. And then from there, now look, we have that 2g plus 5, which is common in both. And then my other bracket would be made up of 3g plus 1. 3g, if I take out the 2g plus 5 out of here, and then that plus 1 if I take the 2g plus 5 out of there. So there you go. All right, let's try a few more just so that we can get used to this. So I'm going to bring out all of these. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'd like you to pause the video, give them a try, and then come on back and check your answers. Okay, so let's go ahead and answer these. 3 times 8 is 24. Middle number is 14. So my two numbers are going to be a negative 12 and a negative 2, because if you add those together, you get negative 14, but if you multiply them together, you get a positive 24. So 3x squared minus 12x minus 2x plus 8. And then I'm going to look at my first two terms and my last two terms. So 3x is what I can common factor out, leaving me with x minus 4. A negative 2 is what I can common factor out, leaving me with x minus 4. And so x minus 4, 3x minus 2 is the answer for the first one. For the second, I'm going to go 3 times negative 4, which is negative 20, and a positive 8. So those two numbers are going to be positive 10 and negative 2. So I'm going to replace my middle term with a positive 10x and a minus 2x. And then from there, I'm going to look at my first two terms, and I can take out a 5x. Leaves me with x plus 2. My second term, I can take out a negative 2, which leaves me with an x plus 2. And then my common factor is x plus 2, and then 5x minus 2. All right. Negative 5 times, or positive 5 times negative 1 is a negative 5. My middle term is a negative 4. So if I have a negative 5 and a positive 1, that brings me to negative 4, but negative 5 times positive 1 is negative 5. So let's replace our middle term with a negative 5n and a positive 1n. And then I'm going to take a look at my first two terms and common factor out an n, 5n, which gives me n minus 1. And then out of my second set of terms, I can't take anything out, so I'm going to put a plus 1, remember, as a placement holder, and that still leaves me with n minus 1. These are the same, n minus 1, and then 5n plus 1. All right, and then my last here, 4 times 7 is 28. Middle term is negative 11. So both my numbers have to be negatives. So negative 7 and negative 4. So 4n squared minus 7n minus 4n plus 7. And then these two terms, I can take out an n, giving me 4n minus 7. And these two terms, okay, it doesn't look like I can take anything out. So normally I would put a 1, but then it won't match up. My signs will be all wrong, and I want it to be identical to this set of brackets. So I'm going to take out a negative 1. By dividing each of these by negative 1, it just changes their signs. So that becomes a positive 4n, that becomes a negative 7, and now we can see that they are exactly the same. So 4n minus 7, n minus 1. Okay, so these are, it's just about practice. It's just about taking these steps and following them. So let me just copy these steps for just a minute. Okay, so we want to find two numbers that multiply to A and C. Oh, that doesn't look good. Let me just expand this out. So there. Find two numbers that multiply to A and C and add to B. So we're going to multiply your first by your last and then compare that to your middle number. Once you find those two numbers, you just replace them. Okay, so now you're going to have 4 terms, and then from there we just do our factoring by grouping. This just takes practice, practice, practice. So practice away, and if you have troubles, please come back and see me.